This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We'd really appreciate it if you sent us, or if you wrote a positive review and shared the podcast with friends. We also love hearing from listeners. You can use our Contact Us form on the website to send us questions, suggestions, ideas for future episodes. Today, we're really excited to get to speak with Paul Silvia, who is the Lucy Spinks Kecker Excellence Professor at the University of North Carolina-Greensboro. Among many other things, Paul studies the psychology of creativity and the arts, particularly how people come up with good ideas and why they find art interesting, appealing, and awe-inspiring, which sounds like great topics of exploration. We're talking mostly with him today about his book, How to Write a Lot, A Practical Guide to Productive Academic Writing, which our guest Liz Bucar referenced in episode 19. But his other books include Exploring the Psychology of Interest, also Public Speaking for Psychologists, a lighthearted guide to research presentations, job talks, and other opportunities to embarrass yourself, and Write It Up, Practical Strategies for Writing and Publishing Journal Articles. So in other words, Paul, you are used to writing about actually really useful things that other academics might benefit from.
Well, you can always count on some of the humanities to find my work useful, I guess. I find quite a lot of it a bit arcane and niche, but I do like writing about writing and professional development topics. I think academia just doesn't have enough of that.
Yeah, obviously, I mean, for our podcast, you were very appealing to us because this is sort of our goal to make the writing and publishing processes more transparent and understandable. And so I'm curious, what led you to write the book, How to Write a Lot, and what were you drawing on in giving your advice in it?
It was a little impulsive, I'll say. I think there's been 2 editions now, and if anyone's had the misfortune of reading them both, I don't know who would, but perhaps someone who's like deep in the procrastination hole trying to work on their own writing. But they're very different. And the first one came out when I was but a wee assistant professor way back in the days. And the context for it was I always sort of enjoyed writing, and in graduate school I got a lot of good advice about writing. And when I graduated, my first job was in Germany. I moved to Germany, and I was in Germany. I was with my partner, and I didn't really speak any German or know a whole lot of German. It's kind of a long story or a short story. And so, I got a lot of writing done when I was in Germany. It was kind of a job, kind of a postdoc, spending a lot of time by myself, just thrashing out this book on the psychology of interest. And it's like, wow, this is really great. Writing books is easy. Like it was, and maybe it's easy when you're underemployed and don't know anybody and a little bit socially isolated in a place where you don't speak the language. So eventually I got a real job. So we moved out here to North Carolina, and I got this job. And I think like a lot of people, the first faculty job is a little bit eye-opening. There's the glamorous world of teaching and service and administration, and just the swirling mushiness of all of the things that go into this kind of job. But then writing got quite a bit more challenging. And that book, Exploring the Psychology of Interest, came out in 2006. Let's just say kind of was supposed to come out sooner than that. Let's just hope no one really sees the delivery date on the contract, and that's been lost to the Oxford University Press Archives. It was 4 or 5 years late. It was like that book was just like weighing on me in a pretty terrible way. And so this was just on my mind. And so I was doing a lot of reading about writing and thinking about writing. And ironically, my background is in motivational psychology. And it took me a while to think that this might actually have some relevance to practical problems of motivation, such as this. It's like, psychologist. So, but I also had a lot of friends. Like this university is pretty tight, and I had a lot of friends in a lot of departments. And my other major in college was in the humanities. It was religious studies, actually, kind of a theme on your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so you kind of know whenever you're having problems writing a book and you happen to know a bunch of historians, they just want to jump in and talk about problems writing books. And a friend of mine in particular, who was Shell Logan, who had a joint appointment in history and psychology, we would get to talking, just friends who did architectural history, and a lot of the senior faculty offered some good advice that kind of clicked well with other things I was reading. And so I just kind of reoriented how I did it. I think like a lot of people, like it's easy to be productive when you have no obligations, but when you have obligations, you need to be a little bit more planful or intentional. And that was kind of the seeds of it. And I figured some things out. And after some years of just writing going well, we were trying to get some professional development material together for the graduate students. And this was just something so many people were talking about. I just said, maybe I'll just write some of these ideas down and put it together in a really sort of short and somewhat underdeveloped book. And I just had psychology people in mind. I just had sort of psychology graduate students. There's a lot of inside humor and veiled humor and inside veiled humor in it. But it just was something I kind of wrote for some people I knew specifically. I thought maybe a few people might get a kick out. But I didn't really expect it to find an audience. It was much, in hindsight, it was really kind of a writing to learn experience to try to see if it would somehow be helpful to me to try to make these things on paper, live on paper, and not just in my chaotic head.
Yeah, so it sounds like you had that experience of writing actually going well at the beginning, as you mentioned, because you were in one of those situations where there weren't a lot of other obligations and you didn't know a lot of people in Germany. And then you had the plunging into the tenure track position and all those responsibilities, and many of them are fun. And so they're kind of good distraction from writing. And then I'm guessing you heard from other academics who were struggling too, like you had some realization, this is not just me. And then it sounds like writing, as you said, started to go better. Was it, I know in chapter 3 of your book, you talk about the idea of writing, having a writing schedule. And in your book, not waiting for the right feeling, but instead treating your writing as a class that you teach, so that you always show up for your class. We professors never have that "do I feel like teaching today" kind of barrier.
Yes.
So is that which of these steps do you feel really made the difference in the writing starting to work again for you in getting things done?
I think the scheduling is the biggest cornerstone for things, and for a lot of reasons. I think one is, with my psychology hat, is people in general deeply overcomplicate and overthink things. And I will say, if I might just in a gently friendly way, there's a certain kind of person who's probably a professor and almost surely humanities professor when it comes to like deep, nuanced interpretation. Like people can get deeply in their own minds and develop like needlessly complex and nuanced theories of why something is happening and what's a path out. And often when people are hitting a wall or some sort of problem with change or things aren't going well, sometimes you just need something really simple and obvious just to sort of to take a first step, rather than just think about why this might happen and come up with like sometimes this overthinking process is itself a kind of procrastination. It really is. It's just people kind of avoiding really doing something by just sitting and talking with people about how bad it's going. So the schedule's the cornerstone of it, because for one reason, it solves most of the problems. Like most of the problems people have, I think if you my kind of model of it is that the job is sort of mushy and chaotic because people have a lot of obligations to a lot of people where they work, and it's part of the free-flowing nature of academia a little bit. And it's part of the generous culture of academia too. Like it's there's a lot to be said for it. But that makes it hard to find the time to write when people are looking for the time to write. Like when people are just looking for the hole, like there's got to be a hole there. They're unlikely to find it, or they're going to find it. If you sort of wonder why some time is free in your schedule, there's usually a good reason why it's free. It's a terrible time. Like people are tired or burnt out, or it's a time that's better served on something else, like your broader life or your family. So when people just kind of vigilantly look for time, they tend not to find it. And that's where I think a little bit of a cycle of overthinking despair happens, because they think, well, what's wrong with me? Other people are writing a lot. Why can't I get this done? And you get these sort of fitful false starts of like, ooh, this Thursday looks really good. Then Thursday arrives, Thursday does not look really good. And then they feel sort of disappointed. And what did I do wrong? And maybe this next Friday, I'm going to stay home all Friday. That goes okay, but not great. People are like, wow. And the cycle of hope and dashed hope and hope and dashed hope, I think is really destructive. Like that's the more insidious side of always trying to find time to write, is that it's not just that it doesn't go well, but when it doesn't go well, people kind of can fall in a little bit of a psychological pit of despair and can feel a little hopeless. So I think the schedule is key. And I think using teaching as an analogy is key, because there are things that we really defend and that others respect. And I think also the amount of time is pretty good too. I think 2, 3, 4 hours is really, really great for most people. Probably more for many who aren't working on books. So I think it's just something like really tangible and concrete. That's like a good place to start for most people. Like most people will benefit from it if they're the kind of people who like to schedule things. And from there, you can start adding on layers, or at least from there, make a step towards something that works for you a little bit better. But it's a place to just sort of stop the process of like, maybe this and maybe this and maybe this, and create some space where people can sit down, open their files, and reacquaint themselves with their project and take like one step.
Yeah, I mean, and you do say up front, the writing every day is many people's ideal, but as you write, it's not practical for everyone. And I guess which is helpful for people to just be reassured it might not be possible, that's okay. But the schedule of it, I guess the comparison to a class is you're not always at your best, or the class doesn't always go perfectly, but you're
Mm-hmm.
still showing up for it, and progress is being made over
Yes.
time, I guess, is part of it.
Yeah, and I think you can. And I think there's something to be said when people find a schedule at work. Some days are going to be better than others. When you study the psychology of creativity, like inspiration, feelings of inspiration are very fickle, but they also tend to be an effect rather than a cause. Like working on something creative tends to make you feel inspired. It's rather than feeling inspired motivates you to go do something creative. It's not so different from, I hear there are people out there who enjoy jogging and running about on the streets. And they often say you don't feel like it beforehand. You feel like it while you're doing it. And this is true of human appetite. There's quite a lot of things that you will especially crave, but you really enjoy when you do it. And I think inspiration has this quality that you feel like doing it once you've started and once you're doing it. So I think if people can just find a few good hours, then they have the space to reacquaint themselves with the project. And sometimes it's going to go really well and you're composing a lot. But most of the time, you're maybe just getting a little done. And I think there are some days where people are more tired or grumpy, undercaffeinated for a lot of reasons. And I think you can kind of go with your moods and energies. Like those are great times for making a list of stuff you got to get from the library, or grinding out. At least here in psychology, we have APA style references, which were much maligned, but perfect when you're like super tired and you just want to get something vaguely productive done. You could work on references or read something, or you can do something that's not writing a paragraph that is somehow moving things forward. You can kind of lay the groundwork for the next time you have some writing, and maybe you'll get some better writing done. So I think people can go with their energies and moods, and as long as they're making some progress, they're making progress. But primarily, they just feel better about their writing. They're not in this cycle of hope and despair and hope and disappointment. That it's cool that you can have a bad writing day, like the 2 hours were not that productive, but it's kind of okay. It doesn't have any general implications for your writing. You're back at it on Thursday. It will probably go better because it can't go much worse, really. And there, that's it. And you're not. It's not like this was my one chance. The day was free, and Grandma had the kids, and I didn't use this chance. Like the stakes are just so much lower when it becomes routine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that does seem a real key. Along with this idea that you're expressing of sometimes the feeling will come after the action, doing it and inspiration might follow instead of waiting for the inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
I know some folks will push back, and maybe part of me does too, in the sense of, but things are so much easier when I'm feeling, instead of having the uphill feeling, I'm having the downhill feeling if I'm in the certain mood or flow. What do you say to folks who feel like that the right feeling is really important?
Well, they're right. It's true. That's the perversity and in some ways cruelty of it all, is that it's easy and it's effortless, and especially when you're writing the paragraphs, they come smoothly. Maybe you surprise yourself with like a cool idea, a cool connection. The words seem nice, and it feels like it's coming from this really authentic place, and the work is good. And in all creative fields, people talk about this experience of flow and this sense of immersion and losing yourself in the work. And it just sort of feels like the work comes from someplace really vital. This is one of the truly enduring ideas in the history of just how people across cultures talk about creativity, and that's what kind of makes it hard. And it's a little bit like, well, it's more than a little bit like gambling, like slot machine gambling. Like the reason why these are so gripping, it's not because you never win, it's because you win unpredictably. And it's not that you win sometimes, not that you win every 10th time, it's that you win unpredictably, and this makes it a little bit gripping. And I think that when people are waiting for inspiration, it's a lot like that. Like it's a little fickle, it's a little unpredictable, and you could be waiting a long time, pulling the lever or pushing the button, and it's not happening. I do think, though, there's a lot of wisdom from people who, both professional writers and creative writers, and just people who work in creativity arts. They seem to have developed a lot of tools for, encouraging the muse and deepening a sense of flow. There's a really wonderful book called Writing in Flow by Susan Perry that was a kind of a survey study, but also case studies of writers and poets, and was interested in the flow experience in their writing. And at least something I took away really strongly from it was there's a very strong, almost superstitious ritual to their work. And you see this in a lot of creative fields. And when you're on the outside looking in, you see the ritual, and we might get too distracted by the particulars. Like, ooh, this writer, she uses a fountain pen. What if I got a fountain pen? I shall turn to eBay and search for fountain pens now. Or, ooh, he listens to jazz music. Or like, ooh, she has a cabin retreat. And people get a little bit too focused on like the eccentricities of it, and when really the point is there's a really steady routine. And what the routine does, like a lot of rituals, they help people enter a more kind of reflective, a less ego-driven, a less self-conscious frame of mind and become immersed in something. And so the fact that people who do creative work so consistently are doing this is, I think, a lesson for us, that it looks like writing in the same place with the same stuff, the same things we drink and the same music, that in general, just reducing the variability in it is more likely to do it. The actual place might not matter as much, but the same place. People in meditation I've met talk about this, that there's spots where they meditate, and it doesn't matter the spot. It just matters that it's the same spot, because it helps them enter this kind of flow-like frame of mind. So I think it's fickle, but it's a little bit controllable. And I think, ironically, sometimes when people are seeking inspiration, they think, I just need to try something different. Maybe I'll go write at a coffee shop. Maybe I'll go write outdoors. Maybe I can go get a new computer. But it's really quite the opposite. I think it's more about funneling in and looking for constancy and consistency. I think it's more likely to breed this kind of inspired feeling or coax it a little bit more.
For you, what have been the things that have been breeding that kind of flow state or ability to write well?
I think writing often doesn't feel like it's going well. I will say, I think this is, but I think I've come to be, I just sort of accept it, and I think that that's part of it. I think it's easier when you just have some acceptance of it. I think consistency and constancy really helps. Like, I think I am also maybe a little bit superstitious about where I'm writing and setting it up and having some things. And I have all my little paraphernalia, and little stuffed animals and little statues my daughter made, and I got a little board, and I got my books that I never read or ever consult, but they're sitting there, these books right there. And I think the consistency helps. I do listen to pretty limited range of music when I write. I think this has just sort of happened over time, that there's certain kinds of music that I'll listen to that's very repetitive, and a really limited range of music. I think that these kinds of things help in feeling inspired. But it's also okay if not. I think something I've gotten better at over the years is just saying, I'm not feeling as great today, or just irked today, or whatever today. But there's something I can do. I forget where I read it, but one of these books had this great line: no one ever gets editor's block. And maybe I can just look at something I wrote and scrape away the articles. Maybe I can download these articles I need to read, or maybe I can put in some interlibrary loan requests. Like, I can do something so that when I'm feeling better, like when you're not in the mood for deep reading, you can just make a list of stuff you should read. There's things you can do to go with your moods a little bit. So I think, finding strategies for the really, really uninspired days is maybe the other side of the coin, I suppose.
But yeah, you have a great line in your book. Academic writing should be more routine, boring, and mundane, which I think gets at this, let's not be so precious about it. Let's maybe have sort of lower expectations in a way. I wonder if you see it that way for your writing sessions.
Yes, I think from the perspective of motivation, everything gets tighter when the stakes get high. And I think that's the idea that I'm trying to get at a little bit, that we need to kind of lower the stakes a little bit for writing. So one of these stakes is what we talked about with finding time to write and making writing happen at all. So people get really anxious and despondent when they're just like not making progress. For people who are mostly writing books, you can get a real estrangement from a book project. Like, people who haven't touched a book for years of years. And and then like the commitment to work on it again is just so momentous and so big. I think when when writing's more routine, these kinds of stakes diminish. It's less of a thing like, today I'm going to write. I think in my mind, it's contrasted with things like, I'm not going to write all semester, but I'm going to plan this really nice retreat. And the retreat, it's going to be in a cute Northeastern cabin. Oh, it's going to look so cute. Okay, take pictures. And I'm going to go stock up on all this special tea. And I'm going to bring, my coziest cable knit sweaters. And oh, it shall be so glorious, this paradisical future where I shall be more productive and more inspired than I am now. And then they get there and they just feel this tremendous pressure because now is their special time and it's not going really well. And then people get sort of trapped in this whole, like, I was so looking forward to this and it's not going well. And then they kind of spiral off into overthinking. So I think the routine of it is helpful. I think when viewing it as a little bit more like a craft, a little bit less like an art, can help people do more artful work.
Yeah. One of the other things you bring up in the book is writing groups, which I imagine can be part of the making it routine if you're in that kind of group that regularly meets or is in touch. Who do you think writing groups work well for?
I think this is definitely, if you're one of these people sort of thing. So I've met, I think the two most common kinds you really get are let's just kind of check in and talk about how the projects are going groups. And these can be kind of short and informal. These are really kind of like, they have striking similarities to like recovery and support groups. Realistically, it took me like way too long to kind of realize that, but they do. And this is where people just kind of get together. How's it going? Maybe people can like vent in a disgruntled way a little bit about how like the publisher's taking way too long and the viewers are taking forever. But people can set some goals, talk about how it's going, get some social support. These are good places for mentoring, and these kinds of groups. Some people just don't want any part of it. Some people do, and I think actually, I think in academia, the older generations of academics were trained to be or selected to be more kind of lone wolf types, like I go it alone. Whereas I think the younger generations in academia bring a really warm, communal culture of support that I'm here to support others and get support myself. And this is something they're looking for. But these are nice groups because people don't have to know anything about what other people are writing because they're not getting feedback on it. And they're not reading chapters. They're just there for, we're all working on something hard. Let's check in once a week, every 2 weeks. A lot of people will benefit from this. It just makes it a little bit less lonely and shows the struggles are a little shared. The one that's different and more polarizing is like sitting down and writing with other people in the room. Mm-hmm. So some people love it. It just helps. I think either they are squirrely people and having other people around helps them stay still, or misery loves company and that's just perfect. Or it gets them out in the same way that people like to jog together and have running partners that maybe neither would really do it when the weather's pretty cold, but someone's expecting them to be there. So for some people, it really clicks. For other people, it just does not click. There was a professor of English once who I talked to who really chafed against this, and the faculty development program at the university was like really encouraging it and really promoting it. He said, I don't like writing in public. I don't like writing in public. And I was like, I agree. I'm just too much of a squirrely people person that if like I'm sitting in a room, there's like a bunch of my friends there and we're all working on our books, I will just like interrupt and get coffee and make quips. And I'm like the bad person to have in these kinds of groups. I'm kind of less productive. So there's not like an answer or right way to these things. If they click with people, they really click. If they don't do it. Like it's totally fine. I think it's not an obligation, but like a lot of things, people could try it once and know immediately if it works for them. And if it doesn't, don't do it again. It's fine.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's the right attitude to have. Another reason that the writing groups are sometimes helpful for us is because of the deadlines that we set with other people. And I often find this helpful. I do work towards a deadline, but I did just have the experience of like blowing right past a deadline. And it does bring this shame, and it did bring this kind of feeling for me of like, wait, why are these deadlines good? Because sometimes it's very easy for me to just disregard them, and then they bring a lot of sort of bad feeling, and I'm very then hesitant to reset a deadline with my friend because am I going to disappoint again and not submit? So what do you think of that helpfulness of deadlines or not?
Yeah, I gotta admit, my feelings are a little mixed. I think with maybe it's perhaps being a psychologist, people are hilarious and funny, and they're very creative, and much of human creativity is pointed in the wrong directions for ignoble ends. And one of them is just like procrastination and self-deception and self-delusion. And I think people saying, I'm going to set my own deadlines. I'm going to set a deadline. There's some graduate student, dissertation boot camps that I'm part of, and they're a lot of fun. And students are confronting this big project, and it makes sense to break it down. And one met with their advisor during the boot camp, and they set a series of deadlines. And looking at it, you immediately think like, wow, these deadlines are oddly regular and smooth and symmetrical. One chapter per month. And the deadline is like the first of each month. Oh, wow. And like people will come up with these deadlines that are aesthetically appealing, oddly smooth, like every 2 weeks I shall do this.
Right.
And they write the deadlines down, they put them in a calendar of some sort, etch them somewhere, communicate them to others, and they feel better because they did do something useful, and they took some constructive step. Mm-hmm. And it's not madness to do this kind of planning. It's good. But what force did these deadlines ever really have? Like were they ever really realistic? And it's so challenging for people to forecast how these things will go. And I think you can chalk it up to just the general human caprice of feeling that the future is more knowable and controllable than it is. And for every deadline, there's like a nail in a car tire, and a child getting sick, or global pandemic, or anything. Mm-hmm. And it's so, I'm not like anti-deadline, but I think we can turn it the other way. And I think it comes from the same place of saying like the future is sort of unknowable. Things are unpredictable. There's not a lot that's really controllable sometimes. But so what's under our control a little bit more. And I think it comes back down to like routine and regularity. Like if this is more setting kind of, instead of setting deadline goals, like goals for your time or goals for your calendar, or hoping that one's future self is more motivated and attentive than one's current self. You can just sort of set goals about like your behavior and activities now. Like you can say, I'm going to finish a chapter a month. Or you could say, it's summer, I'm relatively free. I'm going to work on this 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. If I did that, I'm probably going to get about a chapter a month, maybe more, maybe less. After 6 months, maybe I got 4 or 5. 6 months from now, if someone said you're going to have 4 or 5 done instead of 6, I would probably be pretty happy with that. So I think setting more goals or aspirations for what you're going to do, like I'm going to work on this consistently, and this is like the path to meeting some goal for time I have, is more realistic, or at least more soothing. I think for really long range projects, like people forecasting books, like these contracts, they have delivery dates. When are you going to do this? And people tend to break it up into these weirdly symmetrical chunks, like 2 months for this, 2 months for this, when I think thinking of how am I going to accomplish this? Like, what's the path? Like, instead of just saying, yeah, I could probably do a chapter in 2 months, like when and where am I really going to do this chapter? Like, what are the other activities I'm not going to do during this time? Like, what's my no list of things I'm going to turn down? Like, how am I going to make the time and space this week? Because this is part of that month. I think this is more tangible and more realistic for people to think of what they can do in the present themselves, than for the distant future when we all have more time and have slept better, allegedly.
Yeah, and it does feel like a lot of sort of, I don't know, self-help or time management kind of literature is moving towards that. We can sort of schedule and plan the effort better than the outcome.
And it's true, yeah, because people are really, really bad at forecasting the future. And much of it is because we're just naturally upbeat and optimistic. And we just assume we're going to have more energy and more time and more motivation and better weather. And we'll just be smarter and brighter. And once the dust settles and the decks are cleared, we'll just want to do it.
Right.
We'll just want to do it. But, the frazzled and chaotic now was the blissful, halcyon future 6 months ago. And that's the core of the problem.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions we ask all guests. I think they're really relevant with you. One of them is about something you wished you had known about writing or publishing earlier in your academic career.
Lots. I wish I had figured out the routine a lot easier. It would have made things a lot smoother early in my life. But I have no regrets about that. I think you learn a lot from these kinds of growing processes and these kinds of setbacks. And I think if someone had told me to do this while things are going well, I wouldn't have listened. It would have been just like lots of other advice someone hurls at you that doesn't seem like relevant or applicable. I wish someone had said something like, hey, when you get this first job, you're going to be really, really, really busy, and start to think about your work this way. I guess I would add, I wish, maybe the big one, I would say, is I wish people had talked to me about being more selective about what I wanted to work on and where I wanted to spend my time. That took me far too long. And I think it took me a while to figure out that sometimes writing isn't going well on something, especially a long-term project like a book. Like the book isn't going well because I'm doing too much writing on other things. That writing projects compete with other writing projects, and some writing projects are really parasitic. And I need to say no to more things, and there's probably some kinds of writing that are maybe not worth the time, and that to focus more on what is more fun and interesting than just writing something to write it.
Is that like saying no to the book reviews or encyclopedia projects that sometimes aren't, worth as much in your academic career?
Yes, I think for example, for listeners in the humanities, I think this is like the best example. Like, you're working on a book, and then someone else, they have a contract for an edited book, and the edited book is in your area, and they say, hey, would you like to contribute a chapter to our edited book? And you're flattered because you're an assistant professor and this person is some grizzled old timer. And then you think, I've got my own mouths to feed. These hungry, I got a table of contents. It's starving and withering away. I need to feed my own table of contents before I feed someone else's. But it's a reason why it's challenging, is that these are interesting. They can build relationships. They can help you develop aspects of your argument that might not appear in your work. Like, there's reasons why these are tempting. Same with book reviews. I think my sense from my friends in English and in history is that book reviews are the big parasites. Because like, oh, this book looks so good, I want to read it anyways, and then it's over. You're stuck. In social sciences and the sciences, so much work is collaborative. Sometimes the parasitic projects are collaborative projects where you're in the orbit of another group and you're like, hey, let's do this together. It will be fun. And it will not be fun. It's never fun. And so that's often what it is that, hey, we should do this. And it's like, we should do this really means that you should do this. And both people are sort of thinking that. So, and sometimes it's the projects themselves. Like I have 2 book projects that just evaporated. One didn't quite evaporate. It left a residue of like 130 manuscript pages. I don't know if I could have prevented it, but sometimes some projects were not well conceived from the start. Some things were probably not worth starting. But I don't know. I don't know if it's a solvable thing. I think, but just this is something I wish how to be more selective and choose my writing more wisely is. Wish someone had sat me down earlier and tried to talk sense into my total know-it-all younger self.
Mm-hmm. Another question we ask guests is if there's a writing habit or practice that's working for you.
For me, it's probably an obvious one. I think the scheduling helps. I know some people have the impression for read my book that I'm a very sort of one of these diligent. I've got my planner and I've got my backup planner. Like I got an Apple AirTag for my planner in case I lose the plan. It's kind of quite the opposite. Like I think some people are really like into routines and habits and schedules because they're just wired tight. They are the diligent, conscientious among us. And others, it's more a way of controlling a somewhat flaky and impulsive self. And that's really me. If I didn't schedule writing, I probably wouldn't do it. There's just so much stuff that's fun. Or I would just read all kinds of things and talk to people about all kinds of things. And my mind saying, this is being productive as a scholar. And well, that's clearly part of it and part of the joys of it. That is just procrastinating and wasting time for me. I would just read and talk and enjoy and read and talk and enjoy and never really write. So for me, the scheduling really helps. Something I don't do as often as I used to, but I find helpful, particularly when writing books, is word tracking. So this I used to do very seriously, very diligently, and I still break it out when every book has those chapters you're like super excited to write, and then there's always like at least one chapter where you're like, I kind of need that one there. Don't know as much about it. Looked a lot better in the table of contents of the book proposal, and you're just kind of like slogging through it. And I think word tracking helps. It can show you that what felt like a really unproductive writing day was actually much more productive than you thought. So that's another one. I wish, and I have to give a shout out to our Graphia group, our weekly writing group, which has been meeting more or less weekly for an unusually long time, maybe around 2004 or 5. So it's in many incarnations, but this I always just kind of find helpful of just checking in, seeing how it's going. And I think if someone's struggling with the writing, the big 2 really is look at your calendar, aim for schedule, and just get with some like-minded people and just get coffee once a week to talk.
Paul, just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to share with us, especially because this is so related to your areas of research too, motivation and writing.
These tough open-ended questions, I think. So I suppose I would say there's really not a single way. Like I'm kind of Mr. Writing Schedule, and I love writing schedules, but there's really not a single way. And I think what's really important is that people have a sense of peace and satisfaction about their writing. It's not about trying to churn stuff out, which is a really unhealthy side of academic culture, writing and publishing. And for me, it's more, do people feel good about how it's going and feel at peace with it? That the schedules and the writing groups, I think for me, are much more about the psychological, emotional side of writing than about the productive part. I think the productive part will happen, but I think these tools are working because they make people just feel at peace with how their writing is going. Like their book is aggravating, but it's okay. It's reasonably going well. And I think so. If people feel that things are just going well, that's great. Don't change anything. But if it's not, a lot of we psychologists say, like, a lot of human problems, like, super complex with a million little causes and a million angles. And there's a lot of life history pathways that can get people to an awkward spot. But for most people, there's one or two or three things out of that spot. Like super complex, multifaceted problems can have fairly simple solutions, or at least there's one or two things people could try that will get them on a path. And I think that's sort of what I'd suggest. If it's not going well, thinking of just scheduling some time with yourself in your project to write and getting with some other people is the place to start. Like that's, for most people, it's a place to start. It might not magic, but it's like it will reacquaint people with what they're doing, make them have an honest assessment of how it's going. And it's a start.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul, for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.